Bye-bye. See you in 5 minutes.
Thank you.
This conference will now be recorded.
Welcome back, everyone. Let's get started with our next presentation. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Tara Zimmerman from Texas Women's University. I know Tara from ASIST, which is actually a relatively long-lived organization of information scientists and librarians. I think it's heading towards 100 years old. I'm sure I don't have the right number, but it has been around for almost a century. And all the folks who do the incredibly important work of defending and upholding our libraries for our communities. Let's hope that libraries outlast the current administration. So with that introduction, Tara, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Carl. I'm Tara Zimmerman. I'm a former librarian turned information science researcher, and I have focused much of my time over the past 8 years looking into the phenomenon of misinformation. So I'm honored to bring my perspective here to the conference today. So we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to start by acknowledging some of the difficulties in our current information ecosystem, and then bring in some historical context, which I think is helpful. And from there, we'll delve into some information theory and current research on misinformation. And I'll conclude my remarks by addressing the importance of media literacy and highlight some specific actions that we can individually take to protect ourselves and contribute to a healthier information ecosystem. So, with the proliferation of new technologies at the fingertips of literally billions of people on the planet, the information ecosystem has become chaotic and overwhelming. Journalistic standards are routinely breached by traditional media outlets, and standards are essentially non-existent on social media platforms. Bad actors flood information channels, and the general population really is ill-equipped to sort out truth from misinformation. So what are we talking about here? Let's look at a few examples. For example, misinformation swirling and spreading around the California wildfires in January of this year was so prevalent that the governor felt a need to launch a website, www.californiafirefacts.com, to address this problem. So we aren't talking about misinformation related to celebrities or pop culture or obscure topics. This misinformation being spread both intentionally and unintentionally by a combination of individual humans and this algorithm-driven computer system is literally life and death level information we're talking about. And unfortunately, this phenomenon isn't really new. Last year, FEMA, the governmental organization tasked with providing aid during natural disasters, of course, reported increasing instances of misinformation interfering with their mission. They have been forced to contend with claims that they are stealing donations, that they are diverting disaster aid to Ukraine. Employees in the field have received verbal as well as physical threats. There have been calls in certain areas to form militias to resist FEMA staff members who are working alongside local officials to provide food, water, and critical information to people in crisis. So clearly this presents a danger not only to the workers just trying to do their jobs, but to all citizens in our country. So-called wellness advice abounds on social media. Crazy things like stories of parasites causing sugar cravings, new wonder cures for every bodily complaint you can imagine. And it's not just random influencers fueling the problem. Debunked misinformation, as you know, about vaccinations and fluoride are now championed by figures like RFK from positions of federal authority. Health information, I just want to touch on briefly because it is particularly dangerous. Misinformation related to our health triggers an instinct to protect not only ourselves, but also our loved ones. So we're more likely to share it with family and friends. We want to keep them safe. So as a result, these falsehoods grow exponentially and literally go viral, which is the perfect word for that. We can't even agree on the basic definition of words in our common language. Take this headline, for example. The White House says it's a fact that the Gulf of Mexico has been renamed. Is that right? Well, someone did take it upon themselves, in fact, to rename this body of international water. This is a fact. But if the person had no right to rename the international body of water, is that actually the name now? So this is very confusing. And I just want to acknowledge these examples to acknowledge the fact that it's distressing. All of this is distressing to us. But I think what can help a bit is to put some of this in historical context. Misinformation causing chaos and confusion is not a new phenomenon. This has been occurring as long as humans have existed. There are some examples dating back to ancient Rome, and it often takes place in these audacious, mind boggling ways. So I just want to share a few examples of that. In the 1300s, an English knight named Sir John Mandeville wrote a memoir describing his travels through Europe, Asia, and Africa, wowing people with tales of his adventures, particularly when he described a tree he found in India that bore gourd like fruits. And if you opened up these fruits, you would find tiny lambs. They were alive, complete with bones, blood, wool, everything. An Italian friar also wrote about the existence of this plant, and it became known as the vegetable lamb of Tartary, Tartary being a large historical region of Eastern Europe and Asia. So, in fact, this plant was discussed by leading naturalists and botanical scholars of the day, some of whom claimed to have studied it personally. And as a result, this myth persisted for almost 4 centuries before finally being debunked as nonsense. And think about who was reading books in the 14th century. Only the most highly educated people in society knew how to read. So these weren't ignorant people believing and spreading this, which I think is particularly interesting. And you can find this story and others in the book pictured here, The Misinformation Age by Kaylin O'Connor and James Owen Weatherall. Another historical example is from the 1700s when Benjamin Franklin created a fake edition of the Boston Independent Chronicle in order to influence the British public against the Revolutionary War. In it, he wrote an untrue article claiming that Native Americans were committing atrocities against people in the colonies at the urging of the British military. He also included false letters to the editor, fake real estate ads, and even a lost horse notice in this fake paper to make it seem credible. He made sure that this hoax newspaper got into the hands of British publishers who then republished the articles, spreading the falsehoods widely and resulting in less public support for the war, which was his goal. In 1835, the New York Sun newspaper reported to readers that there were animal-like beings living on the moon. The heading read, "Lunar Animals and Other Objects Discovered by Sir John Herschel in His Observatory at the Cape of Good Hope." This story even cited the Edinburgh Journal of Science as its source and printed alongside the story this drawing, which depicted supposedly some of the life forms allegedly observed on the moon. So this became known as the Great Moon Hoax, and this series of newspaper stories spread around the globe. And long after its initial publication, those stories were still being reprinted in the US and abroad. And this was actually spoken about, the story of this was told in this children's book called The Great Moon Hoax. More recently, in the 1950s, we experienced the Red Scare. So rumors spread about communists and socialists secretly inserting themselves into the highest levels of government and the entertainment industry in order to stealthily spread their left leaning ideals, supposedly. Joseph McCarthy voiced these accusations and helped to spread misinformation in the news media using various governmental actions to target individuals for over 4 years before finally being exposed and discredited. This reminds me of this famous Mark Twain saying, "A lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes." Or was that Winston Churchill and something about pants? It's important to note here that there's no historical proof to suggest that either of these men was the originator of either of these statements. And this is just another example of how easily we can be misinformed and then pass along that misinformation to others. So, with that as a basis, now I'd like to switch gears just a bit and share with you some information science theory that gives researchers in our field some insight into the current messy information system. So, first of all, let's talk about information poverty. So, with information poverty, power or the lack of it affects a person's ability to seek, find, and use information. So, in other words, if a person doesn't believe that they have access to information resources that will be helpful, they begin to feel defeated. And as a result, they put up self protective barriers, and secrecy and deception increase. A person experiencing information poverty believes that outsiders can't provide useful information and that the risks of seeking information outweigh the benefits. Instances of information poverty can be seen in rural areas with less access to print and online resources, and even in people's reactions to new technologies like deepfakes. Another phenomenon, which you've probably heard of, is information overload. Simply put, this is just being overwhelmed by information. Your system cannot possibly process all of the information it is receiving. Symptoms of information overload include cognitive stress and strain, lack of perspective, high tolerance for error, and difficulty making informed decisions. In 2017, Wardle and Duraction coined the term information disorder, and they broke down this problem into two parts. One being whether or not the information was false, and the other being was their intention to do harm. And so they describe this phenomenon in terms of a Venn diagram that you can see here. So on the left, you see misinformation, which is false information, but without the intent to do harm. So, for example, your Aunt Becky passing along an article her minister shared on Facebook that contained misinformation, but she was not aware of it. She wasn't doing that intentionally. Then in the center of the diagram, you have disinformation, and that combines both pieces. It is both false and there is an intent to do harm. So this is something written and spread expressly with the purpose of misleading people. And then on the right hand, the third category, they call malinformation. Malinformation is true information, but it's spread with the intent of doing harm. So examples of things like this are doxing people, or publicly sharing compromising photos or personal information about someone in order to humiliate, shame, or harm them. Even more recently, the phenomenon of information marginalization has emerged, referring to systemic contextual barriers to information, including things like lack of cultural knowledge, lack of language proficiency. Information marginalization can be seen at both the individual and the community levels, and it results in a range of really defensive information behaviors. So this has been observed, for example, in communities of migrant workers, where trustworthy information sources are lacking and people believe that information is actually being withheld from them. And they lack understanding even about their rights to pursue certain types of information. Other studies have been done observing information marginalization in people with disabilities and their caregivers. So, really, any minority or subgroup outside the mainstream could potentially experience information marginalization. And then in 2020, I introduced my own theory to the scholarly conversation, social noise. So, just as physical noise and semantic noise can interfere with clear communication, social noise is the influence of personal and relational factors on information received via social media. Social noise can confuse, distort, or even change the intended message. When we post on social media, our behavior is influenced by knowing that our friends, family, coworkers, followers, whoever we are linked to on social media are going to see that. So individuals often consciously or subconsciously alter their communication to garner a good reputation with certain people or maybe to build social capital with others they value. Um, so with social noise, I assert that the information we see posted on social media by our friends, family, and others is actually much more about their own self presentation and relationships than it is about accuracy and truth. And so, in terms of misinformation, this relational basis of social media platforms makes it more likely that users will pass along misinformation unknowingly if it is shared by someone they admire or trust because they don't feel the need to stop and fact check it for themselves. In 2023, researchers identified something called the spillover effect, meaning that misinformation has become so common that people are demonstrating decreased trust even in credible, factually accurate news. So, because of this, they claim that misinformation is now a persistent societal threat. In 2024, another set of researchers proved that disinformation presented in multiple modes, such as text plus graphics, video, sound, um, impacts people more than text only disinformation, mainly because the added visuals and sound increase people's anxiety. And this is called multimodal disinformation, and it is much more harmful than disinformation presented as text alone. So, what do we do with all of this research, right? Now that we've defined and clarified the problem, how can we use this information to act in ways that are meaningful and that don't perpetuate and feed into the culture of misinformation? Well, I believe from my position in information science that our most productive path forward is to focus on media literacy skills for everyone in society. So, what do I mean by that? Media literacy is a crucial life skill we all need to exist successfully in the 21st century. And it consists of many interrelated skills. So it incorporates things like the ability to access information from a wide variety of media, to analyze that information and evaluate it. And then, even to go further and be able to respond by using your own voice in those different media to create messages and act in ways that are in alignment with your values. Virtually all careers today require some level of critical thinking about media and media messages, as well as the ability to then produce and work with a variety of media and information. That is what we mean by literacy. So imagine being able to read, but not being able to write. You could never respond. You can only take in other people's ideas. So even the ability to take in information in a thoughtful, critical way is good, but we need to be able to respond as well to be fully literate. I love this quote from the National Association of Media Literacy Education. Media literacy empowers people to be critical thinkers and makers, effective communicators, and ultimately active citizens. So, combining my background working with children from a library perspective and my interest in the power of misinformation, I created the Awareness and Critical Thinking, or ACT program, investigating how school librarians can teach young children to detect and avoid misinformation. This is a project initially funded by a 3-year grant from the Federal Institute of Museum and Library Services, which has now been revoked, sadly, but that's a whole other issue. My goal with this program is to create an intervention to address society's collective vulnerability to misinformation and implement it at the kindergarten to fifth grade level, because this group of citizens will have the most impact on the long-term health of our information ecosystem. After a nationwide survey to assess and clarify the need, I partnered with Dr. Faith Rogo, an early childhood media literacy expert, to develop a set of lessons that can be used to teach young children the basis of media literacy in these really fun, age appropriate ways. So I'd like to give you a couple of examples. One of our lessons uses the popular children's song Baby Shark with kindergarten and first graders. And we watch this video and have fun singing along together. And then we ask the students questions. What did you learn about sharks from this video? So we can see in the video, and you can see in this screenshot here, that the sharks are depicted as bright pink and yellow. So is that true? We would ask the students, and they know. Oh, of course, that's silly. But then we see in the video that the daddy shark is larger than the mommy shark. Is that true? No, actually, the opposite is true. Female sharks are larger than male sharks. And we could go on and on with examples like this. But the point is that baby shark is lots of fun. But if we want to learn about real sharks, we need different kinds of sources. And then we can show them appropriate books, websites, and databases that are actually usable for children of that age. Teaching kids that there are different types of information sources suited for different types of needs as an important foundational lesson in media literacy that is very age appropriate for this age group. Here's another example. Now, this would be a great lesson for, say, second and third graders. I asked the students to look at this picture and tell me what they see. And we can have a discussion about that, and then ask how it makes them feel and give them a moment to think about that. With older students or adults, we might even talk about the fact that this is actually not a photo at all and it was AI generated, but that's beside the point with our younger students. Then I add the caption to this photo that says, "You'll never believe what people did to these puppies. Click here to read the full story." I ask if this changes the way they feel. And I ask, what does it bring to mind for you? And they'll usually say things like it makes them feel sad, angry, but also curious. What did happen to these puppies? So I ask how they would react if they saw this online. And many say they would click on the link because they want to know what happened. So most often, something like this will link to an unrelated site, enticing the user to keep clicking to get the information, or the user will be prompted to provide personal data like name, address, email, to unlock the full story. So this, again, is a great age-appropriate example of clickbait, where inflammatory emotional words or phrases are intentionally used to stir people's emotions up and compel them to click on something online. Inevitably, you will not get the information promised, and instead, someone somewhere is probably getting paid for each click they extract from you. This is what we mean when we talk about clickbait, but we can't assume children or anyone really automatically knows what that means. So it needs to be explicitly explained. Another lesson involving, well, let me start again. Another lesson that I like to do involves asking children if any given number that you can think of is a lot. And so in this case, I would use 15,000. Is 15,000 a lot? And we discussed that. And then I would ask them, if is 15,000 a lot if it's the number of people attending a sporting event? Would that be a lot? And they would say, yeah, that sounds like a lot. And then I would show them this picture of this stadium. Sorry, it's a little bit blurry here, but yeah, it looks like the stadium's packed, right? But then I say, let's zoom out on that picture. What if this is that same picture, we're just zoomed out further? So what if the stadium actually holds 80,000? So 15,000 might sound like a lot, but we have to pull back and look at the bigger picture to really understand what's happening. In this case, 15,000 was the number in attendance at this football game, but it was also the lowest attendance in 20 years at that stadium. So context is so important in all kinds of information, and using this number example really highlights that. So when you see a number reported or stated, ask yourself what other information you would need to be able to decide what that number really means. And that's the importance of context. One final example, and this is something we would use with older children, like fourth, fifth grade, probably. So we would focus on this question of expertise. Here we use someone that children are familiar with for the most part, someone like an athlete like Steph Curry. So he's not just a pro basketball player, right? He's this multi-year all-star champion, renowned three-point shooter. And we show these two ads that he has actually done. The first is for a subscription to an instructional video series featuring Curry giving basketball tips. Then the second is an ad for Subway sandwiches. And we discuss each of these ads and ask, is Steph Curry an expert in this video? So here's where the media literacy skills come in. So we note that these are both advertisements. So that means that Steph Curry was paid for both of these. So would that affect what he's willing to say in the ad? Like most superstar athletes, he's extremely wealthy. So he is receiving a paycheck, but it's not likely that an amount of money would make him say different things about good basketball technique, things he doesn't believe. Basketball is his life, right? That's something meaningful to him. But in the case of the Subway ad, like most of us, Steph Curry probably eats a lot of different foods. And if he weren't being paid by Subway, he might recommend or choose something different for dinner. So in that case, expertise isn't, he isn't a sandwich or a food expert. Um, Practicing this sort of reasoning and common sense is important because children and adults often encounter media where we don't or we can't know all of the answers about the person who made the media, with their background, their motive, but we always have our own critical thinking skills. And just taking things like this and walking students through them step by step can be so helpful. So I wanted to share those lesson examples with you to give you a concrete idea of what the ACT program really is. We piloted this program in 8 schools in 3 different states this past school year and have now made the lessons available at no charge to educators nationwide. We were able to do this by partnering with Project Look Sharp, which is an educational nonprofit focused on enhancing students' critical thinking, metacognition, and civic engagement through media literacy. I'm currently promoting this curriculum at various educational conferences and venues, and then soliciting feedback from teachers and librarians who are using the lessons. If you are interested in learning more about the ACT program or about Project Look Sharp, anyone can create an account for free and access these lessons and all of the media examples that go along with them. And so I'm listing the website here for that, or you can just Google Project Look Sharp. My next step in this process is to seek funding for taking these lessons and developing them into more play-based resources, such as maybe an app or a series of YouTube Kids videos, something that isn't school related, something that would be freely accessible as a resource to parents that they would actually feel good about letting their children use. Um, so that's just a brief overview of what I'm doing in my professional life to combat misinformation. And I know that all of you here are finding ways to address this issue in your own fields. Um, but I'd just like to wrap up by thinking about what can we do as individuals in our day-to-day lives that could positively impact and maybe diffuse the power of misinformation. I really believe there are some basic things that we can do that, regardless of age, profession, education level, income, or even belief system, we can all contribute to a healthier information society, simply by starting conversations and engaging with people around us. So, first of all, one of the things we can do is continue to raise awareness, our own as well as that of others. For example, I recently read a book by Maria Ressa, the Filipino journalist who in 2021 was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. And while her book was originally written for Filipino citizens, it's a warning call for everyone because the situation in her country was triggered by flaws in the information ecosystem, like we've just been discussing today. She points out in her book that social media really corrupts the information ecosystem because the polarization is baked into the algorithms. And she says that to combat this, we have to get back to a fact based shared reality. One of her famous quotes that I like says, "If you don't have facts, you can't have truth. Without truth, you can't have trust. Without these three, you don't have a shared reality. And without a shared reality, you can't have democracy itself." So I think that makes a direct line from misinformation to democracy that we need to keep in mind. So, besides raising awareness, I think we can build bridges by having conversations, especially with people that we don't necessarily agree with. As Brene Brown says, it's hard to hate people up close. So this can be difficult, but it might help to remember that we, the people, are all being manipulated by this misinformation system and this chaotic environment. We need to remember that we and our neighbors are much more in the same boat with one another than we are with any political leader, billionaire, commentator, influencer, talking head, anyone. We and our neighbors who live in the same communities, we're the ones that are actually in the same boat. And I realize I'm mixing my bridge and boat metaphors here, but you'll just have to forgive me. um, Talking to people about current examples of misinformation can be contentious because people get caught up in their feelings and in their political ideologies rather than just facts. So I suggest using incidents like some of these we discussed earlier to demonstrate to our friends and family and neighbors that misinformation, whether accidental or intentional, is not new. This is an interesting and non threatening way to bring up the idea that, yes, large groups of well intentioned people can indeed be misled by misinformation and disinformation. Specifically, I recommend the book, The Misinformation Age, that I mentioned earlier, which gives lots of historical examples and perspective on this. So it may be cold comfort, but it is comfort nonetheless to recognize that this isn't a wholly new phenomenon. We're simply more connected with people and information from all over the world than we were before. And then what we can we do to improve our own media literacy? Introducing the habit of questioning into everyday life is key. So I suggest start asking yourself some of these questions about information that you see, and don't be afraid to bring them up with others in everyday conversation. So if someone shows you an article or brings up something, I wonder why this was made. Who made it? Like, does it even have a name attached to it? So many things don't. What's missing? Like if we pulled back on this, what is outside of the frame of this photo or this idea. How could different people interpret this? What techniques are used and why? So this goes back to the multimodal disinformation. The more techniques that are used, the more sound, the more things that get your emotions raised, that makes a difference. Who might benefit from this message and who might be harmed by this message? So you'd be amazed at how just simple questions like this can open up a world of critical thinking and connection, even with people that we don't necessarily agree with. And here is a concise but powerful resource I like to share outlining key steps anyone can take to identify misinformation. And interestingly, this is put out by the US Department of Homeland Security. So, like the research I cited earlier, they clearly consider misinformation a threat to society. This resource is titled Key Steps for Digital Media Literacy, and it's just one of the resources that the Department of Homeland Security makes available online. So I recommend finding this resource by Googling it specifically. Um, the reason I say that is because the current administration of the organization has not highlighted these resources really on their website. And so they are a bit difficult to find. But if you Google them, they do come up. So, US Department of Homeland Security, key steps for digital media literacy. Oops. And then quickly, here are just a few other resources I like to keep handy and share with people when misinformation comes up in conversation, depending on the situation. So at the top, you'll see check yourself with lateral reading. This is a short little video explaining this particular media literacy strategy, which involves comparing what one source says on a topic to other credible sources that are unrelated. So, not taking a single source as gospel truth. And that might seem very obvious to us in this room, but I think it's less obvious to some people than we would realize. So, it's a good thing to bring up. Below that, the Austin Public Library in Texas offers a guide to media literacy resources that is incredibly helpful and available to the public, contains lots of tools that can help people learn media literacy. And then to the right, you'll see this infographic outlining something called the SIFT method for evaluating information resources. This is something super quick and easy that you can share with anyone. So these are just a few of the resources that I like to share with others, but of course you can use any tools that you like. I would just say make sure to keep the resources that you share super neutral and nonpartisan though. This can help you stay above the fray and avoid getting caught up in the hype of political polarization that is so rampant nowadays. So, in conclusion, our democracy depends on an educated populace. And so each of us has a role to play in that. And this involves respectfully communicating with people you may not agree with and striving to find common ground where you can meet. Remember, everyone is vulnerable. Me and the people I agree with are no exception. Being fooled by misinformation isn't something that only happens to stupid or careless people. No one's above it. And ultimately, it is the abundance of information shared in these novel digital contexts that's causing the real problems. I just want to remind people that we all have power and agency, even these children that I'm working with, and we need to exercise it, even though our actions might seem small. So, what we've talked about here today are essential actions that I believe every one of us can take and must take for the good of our fellow humans, for the good of our country, and for the good of the world. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I've got my references here for anyone interested in them. And then I'd love to hear any questions anyone might have.
Tara, thank you so much. I think you really spoke eloquently to the heart and soul of the themes that we've been trying to encourage and support with people talking to people. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Uh, And I really think that I will use that phrase again, heart and soul of the themes that we're trying to promote. Thank you.
Thank you.
Who has questions?
I do,
Uh,
but you can't hear me.
Peter,
Yeah,
I got hands up on both Peter and Paul. I think that was Paul who spoke up first. Paul.
that's okay. I was trying to get the settings, but it's not showing me to me, but at least you can hear me. Um, Tara, I want to buy you an ice cream and a beer. I mean, I'm so grateful for what you presented. In particular, I'll contact you when we have time, not to take it up right now, but just to let you know to expect an email from me for mobile phone games for kids. I was so happy to see that you have the kindergarten to fifth grade already in your sites and that there's material. Um, so there's a lot for us to share there on that. Thank you.
Great. Yes. Thank you.
Peter, you had a question?
Yeah, I'll leave my picture off because I think it affects my speed, so you can't always hear me. What I was going to say is, you mentioned this example of Stephen Curry in two advertisements, and you said because he's a wealthy person, he would not, and because basketball is so important to him, he wouldn't lie about basketball, but
Hmm.
he might not be quite as truthful about his sandwich preferences.
Hmm.
Um, the problem I have with that is that
Hmm.
I'm a doctor and I know that doctors are wealthy by and large, and that we have opinion leaders who repeatedly lie about drugs and devices, medical devices. They consistently do, um, because they're paid by manufacturers, and it is an enormous problem that we have. So you can't say, well, if it's important to someone, don't believe that they would tell the truth.
Good
We've had
point.
cover-ups in the churches where you would say child abuse is important to church leaders, so they wouldn't lie about that. But of
Right.
course, we know exactly that that's exactly what they've done. So
Right.
there are lots of examples. The other point I was going to make, you mentioned disinformation being this combination of um, falsity and malign
Hmm.
together. But of course, disinformation can be false and intended for good, because the people doing it
Hmm.
are deceiving you, but they think it's for your own good sometimes, can't they?
Hmm.
Um,
I
I mean,
think that would be debatable.
well, yeah, I know. I mean, yeah, if it's false, it must always be bad. But what
Mhm.
I'm saying is their motives in their own mind may be good.
In their own mind. Yes, I completely understand what you're saying. They think they're putting out this information, even though it's a little skewed, to guide people who don't know any better, right?
Well, wouldn't the example you gave of the Benjamin Franklin? It depends on which side of the Revolutionary War you're on. I mean, are you on the American side of the war, or are you on the British side of the war? So I think um, there are examples where two different sides would interpret that falsity in two different ways.
Yes, exactly. And things are not always as black and white, true and false as we would like for them to be. There's
Can I
shades.
just take that point up? Of course, being English, um, of course, the English won, of course, because you were fighting against a German king with Hanoverian troops. So, from my point of view, I think it was a British
Ah,
victory.
Any political
ever the
division.
historian. Thank you, Peter. Thank you for reminding us of history. Uh, other
I think Josh was next.
comments, questions? Josh?
Yeah, first, again, Tara, thank you so much for this work. Everything you're doing is amazing. Um, I'll mention your affiliation with ASIS. I will be presenting at the conference next month outside of in Northern Virginia, outside of Washington D.C. I don't know if you'll be there, but I'll get to meet you in person if you are.
I attend
Uh,
every year, but for
uh,
various reasons, I'm not this year. I'm sorry.
okay, I'll be presenting something about. I'll be co-presenting with a panel about abuses of power. So there you go.
Oh, wow, cool.
And I thank ASIS for giving that opportunity. I also thank you. I said at least two things. One thing about social media that you mentioned is going into my closing talk, and I quote from Maria Ressa's book on how to stand up to a dictator in my closing talk. So I will thank you for prefacing that.
Oh, great.
I'm thrilled. What I wanted to ask, how to put this, one thing I saw, especially like in 2020, 2021, COVID, I work in academia. I saw almost a concern that the word misinformation was getting overused.
Hmm.
It was getting used to any dissenting viewpoint. You gave a great talk about people talking to people who think differently. I started to see that misinformation was getting anything that contradicted the views that they wanted us to have was being called misinformation. And that
Hmm.
was actually that itself was a piece of misinformation as far as I was concerned. But I saw that sort of phenomenon. I saw that where I worked, and I saw that in a lot of other settings. And frankly, I saw it promulgated by this is the whole theme of abuses of power. I saw it promulgated by people in power who
Hmm.
wanted their view to be the only view.
Yes.
How do we think about? Because yeah, one level I don't want someone going out and injecting their veins with bleach because they see something on Facebook and that's how you cure whatever disease. On the other hand, people got to be free to talk to each other so we can hear some different things, even some things that are inaccurate.
Right. Right.
Um,
That's
how do
why,
we think about that, and how do we deal with the phenomenon of calling what you don't like misinformation, so that so you don't actually get diversity of perspectives, which is really important to have.
right.
And you did a great job of talking about that importance.
Yeah, I think that's why it's important. Like the big heading of my project, I emphasize critical thinking, and I use misinformation with people I know more academically, but it's not something I really lead with because of that exact reason. And when people say that, like, imagine parents in schools saying, "Who are you to tell my child what misinformation is?" Like, people get very up in arms about that, and so I do have to be careful about how I use that term and who I use it with.
And parents do get very upset. And parents do accuse people who are saying absolutely true things to them of lying because of the disinformation. This is especially so true these days in vaccines, but also in autism and in genetics. I'm a pediatric person, but also a genetics person. And I see this all the time that people are willing to believe an influencer or the ads about drinking some kind of pink salt water that's going to miraculously make people lose weight, and it's just so ridiculous, and people are making money off of these statements. So Steph Curry may have not represented his favorite food when he did the commercials for Subway, but at the same time, it wasn't intentionally going to do harm.
Right.
Whereas other people are so um, aiming at collecting money from others for malicious
Mhm.
reasons with lies and deception.
Mhm.
So I think getting children aware is an excellent thing.
Yeah, and then, you could take that same example with adults and say, okay, so here the line of motivation is pretty obvious. Why would Steph Curry even be talking about Subway? Well, they paid him, right? But there are so many other examples where a person is talking about an issue and the area behind that and their motivations and who's paying who and is very murky. And those are questions we need to ask ourselves.
So
Absolutely.
uh, I forget which year it is now, but at least several years ago, we did a more uh, systematic breakdown into 5 categories instead of just the 3. And we had misinformation, disinformation, anti-information, caco information, and malinformation. So we had 5 different categories. And one of the explanations, rationalizations at the time was that in order to evaluate the most appropriate interventions to stop this, would be, it's like in medicine, you got to find the right treatment for the right problem. So you got to start with diagnosing which category of the 5 we're dealing with before we attempt the intervention. That was at least several years ago, but frankly, in all candor, to a large degree, I think it's fair to say that I just don't even try anymore. I don't even try to communicate or share those 5 different categories because, um, frankly, there's just been so much pushback of the kind, you know, uh, we can do whatever we want to do. And so that brings me around to your work with the kids and the children and the teens and the young adults. And um, uh, I would add to the set of exercises and teaching of asking questions and asking questions and asking questions. Also, um, the importance of intent and what something as simple as what's the difference between good and bad? What's the difference between good and bad? What is an kindergarten kid know about the difference between good and bad? How about someone in 4th or 5th grade? How about someone in 9th or 10th grade? And some of you may have heard this from me before, but I worked in emergency services for so many years, and we served all ages down to the little kids. And I have to say that one of my most favorite questions to these children was just that simple question: what's the difference between good and bad? And um, over the years, it just was very worrisome, the answers I got, which,
And fact versus opinion, I think, is a big one too, because hearing people speak, if they have a very authoritative persona or their role, kids, but also everybody, we can be tempted to be like, oh, well, that's what they said. Maybe they have no qualifications. Maybe they're just giving, and asking some of those questions, I think, is important too.
well, I know Peter has a question here as well, so I'll get to you in a second, Peter. But just so you know what my experience was in emergency services, the most common answer from children to that question, what's the difference between good and bad? The most common answer to that question was, if I get caught. If I get caught. So there was no
Mm-hmm.
learning or education about any kind of internal moral compass. It was all externalized to, if I get caught.
When was this, and has that changed over time?
Yeah, it got worse over time.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah, my
Yeah,
instinct was
it
exactly
definitely got worse over time.
that
Absolutely.
50
Yeah,
years ago it was more there were more people putting on some kind of values, and now it's just consequences.
it definitely worsened over time. But without question, the most common answer that I got from these kids was simply, if I get caught.
Mm-hmm.
So what that led me to believe is we were really failing in our elementary and middle schools.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if kids are going through elementary and middle school and they don't even have a basic understanding of the difference between right and wrong, good and bad, then we have a problem in our educational schools. I know, Peter, you had your hand up. Please, Peter. Oh, okay. Uh, Well,
And
thank
one last quick thing. It may not be the school's fault. It may be the fault of not getting the right information out through the family as well.
Yeah.
So if kids see that they get away with everything
Mhm.
until they're caught, they think they'll get away with everything. And that happens from the time they're like 2 or 3 years old at home. If they're, punch their little brother and they get away with it, was that a bad thing? I punched my little brother, but nobody yelled at me. So
Mhm.
just a thought.
Well, and also from the perspective of someone who lives and works in a very, very red state, schools talking about good versus bad. I mean, we're already being accused of indoctrination of all types for just introducing picture books, you know. So uh, it's definitely a socio-cultural issue that goes beyond just education in the school system.
Well, this gets to the heart of the question of why we have so much polarization in America. I
Mhm.
mean, we're not even allowed to teach or educate about fundamental differences between what is right and wrong. But
Yeah.
for me, at least as a medical doctor, um, there's a very clear, simple, and easy way to differentiate. I mean, do you hurt or harm another person? Do you cause a death instead of save a life? I mean, they're very, very simple ways, and if we're going to start warring with each other, there's no way that we're going to be neighbors helping neighbors. So we just can't even live together in the same communities. So for me, it's not hard. But then, of course, I'm guided by my Hippocratic oath as a licensed medical doctor and whatnot. We better we're falling behind. Thank you again, Tara. This got to the heart and soul of everything that we're concerned about here today, with people talking to people. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're gonna we got to take a 5 minute break again before we start our expert panel. So we'll see our expert panel back in 5 minutes here. Thank you all. Bye bye.